Hi everybody, it's Curious Raven. Welcome back to Octoberspook. This is episode 3. The door to apartment 43 is at the very end of the hall. It's the one that isn't parallel to any others. And it's also the only white door in the whole building. My girlfriend Sydney and I have lived in the apartment building for almost a year now. And we've never seen anyone come in or out of apartment 43, despite the fact that about once a week, you can hear arguing and crashing sounds coming from inside the apartment. Nobody ever talks about apartment 43. In fact, it seems as though people deliberately make an effort to not talk about it. You can usually hear two voices, a man and a woman, shouting at one another from inside the apartment. It never gets loud enough to prompt someone to check in on whoever is in there. And the fights normally last for about 6 minutes. And then everything is silent once again. It had been about 4 days since the last argument, which should be a good thing, except I could tell that all the people on the floor are growing more anxious as the silence continues. At the end of the week, Sydney and I had just gotten home from the grocery store, and we were standing out in the hall as she unlocked our apartment door. The hall was dead silent, which was weird in the middle of the day, and she put the key in the lock. She froze, turned around to look at me. "Did you hear that?" I listened a bit. All I could hear was the faint sound of the air conditioning. "Hear what?" I asked. "I thought I heard a baby crying." She unlocked the door and opened it, and we both walked into the apartment and set our grocery bags down on the kitchen table. Sydney walked back out into the hall and stood outside the door looking up and down both sides. "What is it?" I asked as I put the eggs away. "I swear I heard crying," she replied, coming back inside. "Maybe it was coming from outside. None of our neighbors have children." She came back in and shut the door. "It was coming from 43. She leaned back against the door and stood there for a few seconds. As I put the groceries away, her eyebrows furrowed as she listened intently. I once again concentrated, trying to hear what she was hearing, but there was nothing. "Do you still hear it?" I asked. Sydney shook her head. "Maybe it was their TV or something." She walked over to the table and grabbed a bottle of water. She seemed distracted as she opened it and took a sip, almost dropping it as she tried to set it down and almost completely missed the table. "Don't you ever wonder who lives there? Why don't they ever come out?" "I did at first. Now I don't really think I care," I replied. "I didn't really care either, but I don't know, gal. I feel like something's wrong." Sydney spent the rest of the day looking worried. I would periodically catch her with her ear pressed up against the door or one of the walls, listening for something. Any time I called her out on it, she would jump and avoid my questions. The only thing she would say was that there was something wrong in apartment 43. Of course, she had no way of knowing that. Neither one of us had ever been inside of the apartment, nor had we ever met the people who lived there. A few of the neighbors believed it was haunted, and there were even a few variations of a story about apartment 43 floating around. The details of the story would change slightly depending on who you asked, but it remained more or less the same. A young couple lived in the apartment. As time passed, they fought more and more until the woman had a baby. After the baby came, the couple seemed perfect until one random night where they were gruesomely murdered. Only the baby lived, alone in the apartment for a few days until someone came to check in on them. Some people claimed the wife murdered her husband and then killed herself. Others believed the opposite, and there were some who claimed that the baby had killed them. I honestly didn't believe any of those stories. There was no news coverage on the events, and the landlord never even acknowledged the apartment. If you ask me, it seemed as if apartment 43 was nothing more than a storage closet, or an old office that wasn't really used, that wasn't currently in use. There was nothing inherently evil about an empty apartment. Creepy? Maybe. But I didn't believe that the ghost of a murderous baby was trapped in there. That night I woke up due to unfamiliar light in the bedroom. I slowly opened my eyes, sitting up in bed as they adjusted. I looked towards the source of light to see a silhouette in the bedroom doorway. The door was wide open and the light was coming from the kitchen. My heart raced in my chest as I extended my left hand out to wake Sydney, but her side of the bed was empty. When I realized it was Sydney who was standing in the doorway, I sighed in relief. "Sid, are you okay?" I asked, yawning. She turned around and stepped back into the room, closing the door. "Sorry, I thought I heard something." She walked over to the bed and sat down, kicking off her slippers and then sliding under the covers. "The crying again?" I asked. "Yeah, but I think it was a dream this time," she said. I laid down again and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I was asleep before I was once again woken up. This time it wasn't due to my light. The bedroom door was still shut and I laid in bed with my eyes open. That time I finally heard it. The crying. It was muffled, barely even audible, unless you really concentrated. "Sid, do you hear that?" I whispered. The crying wasn't hysterical, but more like sniffles with the occasional wail. "Sydney?" I sat up and glanced over to her side of the bed to find it empty again. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and put my slippers on, and I walked out of the room, slowly opening the door, squinting as the light from the kitchen filled the room. I walked down the hall, looking into the restroom and the spare bedroom before I reached the end of the hall. I looked to the left into the living room, but it was empty. The kitchen was empty as well. However, our apartment door was wide open. "Sydney!" I called again, a little louder. There was no response, and it was clear that she wasn't in the apartment. So I stepped out to the hall. It was illuminated by the 5 or so hallway lights mounted on the walls, and I could see slivers of light coming from a couple of apartments where people were still up. I looked down to the right of the hallway and saw the door to apartment 43 was slightly ajar. I took a deep breath, reached into our apartment to grab an umbrella, just in case I needed to defend myself against something, and made my way towards the door. The closer I got, the more clear the crying was, until I was 100% certain that it was coming from 43. Sydney was right. My hands began to sweat as the multiple variations of the horror stories I had heard flashed through my mind. I pushed the door open all the way and stuck my head inside the apartment. There was a little light on somewhere inside, making it a lot easier to navigate. The layout was different from ours. Apartment 43 had a small hallway that led into a living room instead of opening directly into the kitchen. I stepped into the apartment, and the wooden door and the wooden floor cracked beneath me. There was no decor on the walls, and it was a lot hotter in there. meaning that the air conditioning in the apartment probably didn't work. "Sid," I whispered. It was completely silent in the apartment. I couldn't even hear the crying anymore. I scanned the living room and kitchen, but both were empty. I sighed as I forced my way to continue further into the apartment and looked in the first room that I found. It was a bathroom, which was also empty. The light was coming from the hallway from a dimming bulb in one of the light fixtures. I looked into the room, which was a bedroom, but it was also empty. "Sydney!" My hands were sweating even more now, and I had to switch the umbrella from one hand to the other in order to wipe them on my t-shirt. There were 2 more doors in the hall, but one of them was already wide open. It was the closet, and that too was empty. I walked towards the last door, which was half closed, and pushed it, opened with the umbrella, stepping inside the room carefully. There was a pink lamp on in the corner of the room, but the light bulb kept flashing on and off randomly. To the right, there was a white crib with a mobile of the system hanging above it, and leaning up against the crib on the floor was Sydney. She was sitting with her head hung down towards her chest, her long blonde hair covering the upper half of her body. Her hands were at her sides, both covered in blood, and she held a bloody knife in one of them. I rushed over and crouched down in front of her on the ground, lifting her head up and moving her hair out of the way. I regretted it as soon as I did it. She wasn't breathing, her shirt was unbuttoned, and her torso had been sliced open down the middle, from just underneath her breast all the way down to her navel. But that wasn't the worst part. The cut had been crudely sewn shut, the needle and the thread still hanging from the bottom of the wound, and something had been stuffed underneath her skin. I gagged as I backed away from her, my ears ringing. I felt dizzy and nauseous, and I slowly crawled over to the small trash can in the room as I felt the nausea creeping up my throat. I reached the bin just in time to throw up in it, and when I was done I noticed that there was something else inside the bin. I squinted and stared until I could make out the contents. It was filled with Sydney's insides. Oh God. I slid the bin across the room and slowly stood up, feeling like I was going to be sick again. I looked back at Sydney. Her torso was still exposed, and I couldn't seem to tear my eyes away from the gruesome cut despite the returning nausea. As I stared at it, I noticed her skin was beginning to move. I looked 2 steps closer and saw that something was moving inside her, pulling at the uneven stitches, rippling under her skin. I backed out of the room slowly, keeping my eyes on her torso as the movement inside of it increased, her pale skin stretching as the stitch began to rip. I ran out of the room, closing the door all the way and running down the hall. As I rounded the corner, I scrambled to pick up again and noticed Sydney's cell phone under the fridge in the kitchen. I could hear noise coming from the room down the hall, and I ran towards the phone, grabbing it and running out of the apartment, shutting the door behind me. "Help!" I shouted as I ran down the hallway. I made left and at the end of the hallway towards the stairs, not wanting to risk waiting for the elevator, and ran down the stairs as fast and carefully as I could, not wanting to risk tumbling to crash to my death in the stairwell. I dialed 911 as I ran, trying to concentrate on not falling. 911, what's your emergency? You have to help me, I said, out of breath. Someone killed my girlfriend. I think they're still in the apartment. When I got down to the 2nd floor, I heard one of the doors above me open and shut, followed by footsteps. I glanced up, and as I did, I lost my footing at the edge of one of the steps and fell forward into the wall. The phone slid out of my hand and towards the other end of the stairwell. I pulled myself up as fast as I could and kept running, leaving the phone and hoping they would somehow figure out where I was. As I reached the door to the lobby, I skipped the last 2 steps, jumping towards the door. There was a burst of pain in my right knee as I landed, and I shouted in pains as I swung the door open and slammed it shut behind me. I limped out into the lobby, where I saw the ambulance parked outside the building. I limped towards the door and the paramedics came in. "Oh, thank God," I cried. One of them hurried over to me. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I hurt my knee coming down the stairs," I said. He led me over to a couch in the lobby, and I watched as the rest of them made their way upstairs. I could see flashing lights from the vehicles outside. "Thank God you guys got here this fast," I said. I noticed some of the residents standing outside the building, talking amongst each other. "Don't worry, ma'am. Both you and the little guy will be fine." I looked down at the guy. "What? What do you mean, little guy?" "We got a call about a baby locked inside one of the apartments," he replied. "Apartment 43? I asked, confused. No, I don't think so. It was on the 3rd floor. "What about my girlfriend?" I asked. "Is something wrong with your girlfriend?" he asked. "Yes, I just made a call. I didn't get to give the operator all the information. I felt as I was running from the thing." "What thing?" I shook my head. "I don't know what it was, but something killed my girlfriend and she's in apartment 43. "Did you just say apartment 43? I turned around to see our landlord, Mason, standing behind us in pajamas and sneakers, looking like he had just gotten here. I nodded. "And you said the call you got came from the 2nd floor, right? That a baby was locked in the apartment?" he asked the paramedic. He nodded. "Oh my God, that means it's out." "What's out?" I asked. Mason opened his mouth to answer, but was cut off by the sound of a crying baby. "Where is that coming from?" I asked. "The supply closet," he whispered, his face pale as a ghost. Upstairs people started screaming.